I stood there in my work clothes, concrete dust still clinging to my hands, watching my son's graduation ceremony from the back of the auditorium. 23 years I'd poured everything into that boy. Every overtime shift, every aching muscle, every dollar I never spent on myself. And when I finally made it from the construction site to see him graduate with honors, his words hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. "Don't come near me, you look like a bum. I'm ashamed you're my father." But I just smiled, because my son, despite all his education, was about to learn something they don't teach in college. Some lessons. Well, some lessons only a father can provide. Before we continue, please subscribe to stay updated on our latest stories. The concrete mixer had broken down at 3 p.m., right when we were supposed to pour the foundation for the medical center's emergency wing. 20 workers standing around, a $50,000 delivery of concrete going to waste, and the hospital breathing down our necks about the deadline. As the site foreman, I couldn't just walk away. While other fathers were probably at home choosing ties and polishing shoes for their son's graduation, I was elbow deep in hydraulic fluid, trying to save a project that would help save lives. I kept glancing at my watch. 4:30, 5:15, 5:45. The ceremony started at 6. My hands were black with grease. My work clothes reeked of diesel and concrete dust, but I'd made a promise to Ethan 23 years ago when I held him as a newborn. I would be there for every important moment of his life. By the time we got that mixer running again, it was 5:50. I grabbed a bottle of water from the truck, splashed my face and hands, tried to scrub the worst of the grime from under my fingernails with a shop rag. In the side mirror of my pickup, I saw a man who looked exactly like what he was, a construction worker who'd been fighting machines all day. But there was no time to go home, no time to change into the suit hanging in my closet. The drive to the college was a blur of traffic lights and racing thoughts. He'll understand, I told myself. When he sees me in that audience, he'll know I chose him over everything else. I parked and jogged toward the auditorium, feeling the stares of well-dressed parents and their polished families. A woman in pearls actually stepped back when I passed, clutching her purse tighter. I caught my reflection in the glass doors, steel-toed boots, work jeans with paint stains, a high-visibility vest still slung over my shoulder. But I walked through those doors anyway because my son was in there. From the back of the auditorium, I watched him cross that stage. Ethan James Whitmore, summa cum laude, business administration degree. My chest swelled with pride so fierce it almost hurt. This was the boy I'd carried on my shoulders to job sites when I couldn't afford babysitters, who'd done homework by the light of construction trailers while I worked late shifts. When the ceremony ended, I saw him surrounded by his friends near the stage, young men in pressed shirts and their parents in designer clothes, everyone beaming and taking photos. This was my moment. After 23 years of sacrifice, I was finally going to share in his triumph. I walked toward them, my work boots echoing on the polished floor, still carrying the scent of the job site. This was when my son would introduce me to his friends, when he'd tell them about the man who built his future with calloused hands. I approached the group with my heart hammering against my ribs, every step carrying 23 years of anticipation. The polished marble floor seemed to echo my work boots like thunder in a cathedral. Ethan stood there in his cap and gown, diploma in hand, surrounded by his circle, young men who'd never known the weight of responsibility, their parents gleaming with wealth I could only dream of. "Ethan," I called out, my voice catching slightly with emotion. "Son, congratulations." I reached out to him, my calloused hands ready to pull my boy into the embrace I'd been saving up all day. This was it, the moment when all those years of sacrifice would finally pay off, when pride would wash away every ache and struggle. But instead of falling into my arms, Ethan stepped back. Actually stepped back, like I was carrying something contagious instead of just the honest sweat of hard work. "Don't come near me," he said, his voice sharp enough to cut steel. "You look like a bum." The words hit me like a physical blow, and for a moment, the world went silent. I felt every eye in that elegant group turn toward me, saw the barely suppressed smirks on his friends' faces. One of them, a kid with perfectly styled hair and a watch worth more than my monthly salary, actually chuckled under his breath. I stood there, hands still half extended, feeling the concrete dust under my fingernails like evidence of some crime I'd committed. The hurt was immediate and devastating, but something else stirred beneath it, something cold and calculating that I hadn't felt in years. "Ethan," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the chaos in my chest. "I just wanted to congratulate you on— Look at yourself," he hissed, glancing around nervously at his friends. "Look at how everyone else's parents are dressed. You couldn't even be bothered to go home and change. You had to show up here looking like this?" I glanced down at my work clothes, then around at the sea of pressed suits and designer dresses. For a moment, I saw myself through their eyes. A man who belonged on a construction site, not in their polished world of privilege and appearances. "Son, I had an emergency at the site," I explained, keeping my voice level. "The concrete mixer broke down during a critical pour for the hospital project. I had to stay to make sure." "There it is." Ethan's voice rose, drawing more stares from nearby families. "There's always some emergency, always some project that's more important than me. You could have left someone else in charge, but no, your precious job always comes first." The injustice of it hit me like cold water. Every overtime shift I'd worked to pay for his private school, every weekend I'd spent on job sites to afford his college tuition, every dollar I'd never spent on myself so he could have everything he needed, none of it mattered in this moment. "Your work was more important than my childhood," he continued, his voice gaining momentum like a train gathering speed. "And today, on the most important day of my life, you've just proven it again. You chose that job site over being here properly for me. I'm ashamed you're my father." I felt something shift inside me, like tectonic plates finding a new alignment. The hurt was still there, sharp and immediate, but it was being joined by something else, a clarity I hadn't experienced in years. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw not the grateful young man I'd expected, but a stranger wearing the face of the boy I'd raised. "I see," I said simply, my voice carrying a new quality that made Ethan's confident posture falter slightly. That's when I smiled. Not the proud father smile I'd been planning to wear all day, but something different. Something that made his friends stop their snickering and pay attention. Something that suggested this conversation wasn't over, not by a long shot. Because in that moment, in my honest work clothes surrounded by their artificial elegance, I realized that my son had just taught me something valuable. He'd shown me exactly who he'd become, and more importantly, he'd shown me what I needed to do about it. For a moment, I just stood there, letting the weight of his words settle in the air between us. The auditorium buzzed with conversations around us, families celebrating their children's achievements, but our little corner had gone dead quiet. Even his friends had stopped their smirking. There was something in my silence that made them uncomfortable. Without saying a word, I reached into my back pocket and pulled out my wallet. It was an old thing, brown leather worn smooth by years of honest work, held together more by habit than by the fraying stitches along its edges. The kind of wallet that belonged to a man who counted every dollar twice before spending it. I opened it slowly, deliberately. Inside, tucked behind the bills and work permits, were the things I'd carried with me for years. My fingers found the first item, a photograph, its edges soft and rounded from handling. Ethan at 6 years old, gap-toothed and beaming, sitting on my shoulders at the county fair. The colors had faded to that sepia tone that comes with time, but his smile was still as bright as the day I'd taken it. Next came another photo. Ethan at 10, proudly holding up a certificate from his spelling bee. I remembered rushing from a job site to be there for that too, still wearing my hard hat because I didn't want to miss his moment on stage. Then I found the small piece of construction paper, folded carefully and preserved despite its age. A drawing Ethan had made for me when he was 8. Stick figures of a father and son building something together with crayons that had long since cracked and faded. At the bottom, in a child's careful handwriting, "My dad is the best builder in the world." Finally, I pulled out a receipt, yellowed with age but still legible. Disneyland, 2018, his 15th birthday trip. I'd worked 3 months of overtime to afford those 5 days, sleeping in the cheapest motel I could find while he stayed in the Park Hotel with his friends. I held these fragments of our life together for a moment, feeling their weight. Not the physical weight of paper and fading ink, but the weight of every sacrifice they represented. Every early morning, every late night, every dollar I'd never spent on myself so he could have more. Then I extended them toward Ethan, my hand steady despite the storm raging in my chest. His eyes widened as he recognized what I was offering him, the confident mask slipping from his face for the first time since I'd walked over. What? What is this? He asked, his voice smaller now, uncertain. I met his eyes, and when I spoke, my voice was calm, measured, carrying the finality of a judge reading a verdict. This is everything I had left of the son I raised, I said quietly. The boy who used to be proud that his father built things, who drew pictures of us working together, who couldn't wait to tell me about his day. I paused, letting the words sink in. But that boy grew up too fast and turned into someone I don't recognize, someone who's ashamed of the man who gave him everything. I pressed the items into his hand, watching as he instinctively clutched them against his chest. Since you're so embarrassed by who I am and what I do, you won't be needing these reminders anymore, and I won't be carrying around memories of a son who doesn't exist. I turned on my heel and walked away, my work boots echoing in the sudden silence that had fallen over their group. Behind me, I heard Ethan's voice crack as he called out, "Dad! Dad, wait!" But I kept walking. Around us, other families had stopped their conversations, whispers following in my wake like ripples in still water. I could feel their eyes on my back, could sense the uncomfortable shifting of people who'd witnessed something they didn't quite understand, but instinctively knew was significant. Each step carried me further from the boy I'd raised and closer to a truth I'd been avoiding for too long. Sometimes love isn't enough. Sometimes respect has to be earned the hard way. The morning sun was already beating down on the construction site by 7 a.m., and I was grateful for the work. Physical labor has always been my meditation. When my hands are busy, my mind can process things that hurt too much to think about directly. The concrete foundation wouldn't pour itself, and despite everything that had happened yesterday, bills still needed to be paid. I was checking the rebar alignment when Rodriguez, one of my crew chiefs, approached with that careful expression men get when they're about to deliver uncomfortable news. "Boss," he said, pulling off his hard hat to scratch his head. "Your son's here. Says he needs to talk to you." I glanced toward the site entrance, where I could make out Ethan's figure standing beside his pristine sedan, the one I'd co-signed for, the one whose payments came automatically from my account every month. He was wearing khakis and a polo shirt, looking as out of place as a peacock in a chicken coop. "Tell him I'm busy," I said, returning my attention to the blueprints spread across the makeshift table. Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. "I did, boss. He says he's not leaving until you talk to him." I felt that familiar surge of annoyance, not at Rodriguez, but at the entitled presumption in Ethan's demand. The same presumption that had led to yesterday's humiliation. "Then he can wait," I said simply. "Or he can come find me. I'm not running a taxi service here." 20 minutes later, I heard the reluctant crunch of expensive shoes on gravel and construction debris. I looked up to see Ethan picking his way carefully across the site, his face a mask of barely concealed disgust as he tried to avoid the mud and concrete dust that was just part of life here. "You need a hard hat to be on this site," I called out without looking up from my work. "OSHA regulations." The silence stretched long enough that I finally raised my head. Ethan stood there, clean and pressed and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world. Around us, my crew had slowed their work slightly. Not obviously, but enough to listen. These were men who understood respect, who knew what it meant to build something with your hands. "Dad, listen," Ethan began, his voice carrying that same tone he'd used as a teenager when he'd been caught in a lie. "About yesterday, maybe I was a little harsh. A little harsh." I let that phrase hang in the air between us while I continued measuring rebar spacing. This wasn't an apology. It was damage control. "Maybe you were," I agreed mildly, making a note on my clipboard. "Or maybe you were just being honest for the first time in years." "Come on, Dad. Don't be like this. It was a big day. There was a lot of pressure." I straightened up and really looked at him then. Even here, surrounded by the honest work that had paid for his entire life. He couldn't bring himself to actually apologize, couldn't admit he'd been wrong. You know what, son? You're absolutely right. It was a big day. I pulled off my work gloves, giving him my full attention. Big enough that I've had time to think about some changes that need to happen around here. Something in my tone must have warned him because his rehearsed contrition faltered. First thing, I continued, my voice carrying clearly across the site, I'm no longer making payments on your car. That's your problem now. And if they come to repossess it, that won't bother me in the slightest. You're a college graduate. Figure it out. His face went pale. Dad, you can't just. Second, I interrupted, don't come to me for advice anymore. How could someone with such a bright future possibly need help from a bum? You're educated, you're independent, you've got it all figured out. I gestured around the construction site. This is beneath you, remember? So handle your own problems. Around us, I could hear the barely suppressed chuckles of my crew. These were men who'd worked their whole lives, who understood what it meant when respect flows uphill instead of down. They were watching a lesson being taught in real time. Ethan's face flushed red, whether from embarrassment or anger, I couldn't tell. You're being ridiculous. I just need. What you need, I said, putting my gloves back on, is to learn that actions have consequences. Words have consequences. You made your position very clear yesterday. Now I'm making mine clear today. I turned back to my work, dismissing him as thoroughly as he dismissed me in front of his friends. You wanted to be independent? Congratulations, you got your wish. The sound of his footsteps retreating across the gravel was almost drowned out by the renewed laughter of my crew. Rodriguez caught my eye and nodded approvingly. These men understood justice when they saw it. 3 weeks had passed since that day at the construction site. 3 weeks of silence between us, broken only by fragments of information that filtered through the family grapevine like water through cracked stone. Each call from a relative was a small knife twist, reminding me that my son existed somewhere out there in the world, living a life that didn't include me. My sister called first, her voice carrying that careful tone people use when they're walking through a minefield of family drama. He moved out, David, she told me, and I could hear her stirring coffee in the background. Got himself a little apartment downtown, one of those studio places that costs more than your mortgage, if you can believe it. I could believe it. I'd helped pay for Ethan's lifestyle long enough to know how expensive his tastes had become. How's he managing that? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Well, she hesitated. He got a job at some consulting firm. Starting salary, nothing fancy by his standards, but it's something. Though, another pause. The car got repossessed last week. I saw him at the bus stop on 5th Street, looking like someone had died. I should have felt vindicated, should have felt like justice was being served. Instead, I just felt hollow. Then came the call from my brother-in-law, Tom, whose voice carried the gruff approval of a man who'd worked factory jobs his whole life. Kids learning what the real world costs, he said without preamble. Saw him at the grocery store yesterday, comparing prices on ramen noodles like he'd discovered fire. You did the right thing, Dave. Sometimes a boy needs to learn what respect costs. But then my mother called, and her voice was thick with disapproval and disappointment. David Michael Whitmore, she said, using my full name like I was 10 years old again. How can you let your only son struggle like this? He's your blood, your flesh and blood. Ma, he's 23 years old. Age doesn't matter when it comes to family. Her voice cracked with emotion. I've been watching him at church, David. He sits in the back now by himself. Looks like he hasn't been sleeping. This has gone too far. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar weight of guilt that only a mother can place on her son's shoulders. He called me a bum, Ma, in front of his friends, said he was ashamed of me. He's young. He made a mistake. You're his father. You're supposed to be the bigger person. I've been the bigger person for 23 years, I said quietly. Maybe it's time he learned to be one too. The family had fractured along predictable lines. My mother and youngest sister thought I was being cruel. My father, a man who'd worked in steel mills until his hands were permanently stained black, understood. My older brother sided with me. The cousins were split. Even at family gatherings I didn't attend, I knew they were talking about us, choosing sides like it was some kind of war. I tried not to think about it too much, tried to focus on the work, on the steady rhythm of building something solid from nothing. But memories have a way of ambushing you when your hands are busy but your mind is idle. I'd catch myself remembering Ethan at 8, helping me build a tree house, his small hands trying to hold the level steady while I positioned the boards. Or at 15, bringing me a sandwich and a cold beer while I worked on the deck, staying to tell me about his day at school. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, like they were about a different father and a different son. But then Rodriguez handed me a contract that made my blood run cold and warm at the same time. "Big commercial job," he said, sliding the papers across my makeshift desk. "Office renovation downtown. Client specifically requested us. Heard good things about our concrete work from the hospital project." I looked at the letterhead. Morrison and Associates Business Consulting. The address made my stomach tighten. It was one of those gleaming downtown buildings where young professionals went to make their fortunes, the kind of place where Ethan probably felt more at home than he ever had in our working class neighborhood. But it was the signature at the bottom of the contract that stopped my heart entirely. James Morrison, managing partner, Jimmy Morrison. I stared at that signature, remembering a skinny kid with thick glasses who'd sat next to me in Mrs. Rodriguez's algebra class. Jimmy, who'd shared his lunch when my family couldn't afford the school meal plan, who'd helped me with homework when I was too proud to ask the teacher for help. Jimmy, who'd been my best man when I married Ethan's mother, who'd gotten drunk with me the night before the wedding and told me I was lucky to find love so young. We'd lost touch over the years, the way people do when their lives take different paths. He'd gotten a scholarship to business school while I'd started working construction to support my pregnant girlfriend. I'd heard through mutual friends that he'd done well for himself, built a successful consulting firm, married a doctor, bought a house in one of those neighborhoods where the problems were things like homeowners, association fees, and which private school had the best lacrosse program. And now, somehow, by some impossible twist of fate, he was Ethan's boss. I sat there holding that contract, feeling the weight of 25 years of missed opportunities and divergent paths. Jimmy didn't know about Ethan being my son. How could he? My son had been so determined to distance himself from his blue-collar roots, he probably never mentioned having a father in construction. For all I knew, he'd invented some cover story about his family, the way young people do when they're ashamed of where they came from. That evening, I found myself scrolling through old phone contacts until I found Jimmy's number, saved from a Christmas card exchange years ago. My finger hovered over the call button for a long time. What was I even going to say? "Hey, remember me, the guy whose life went in a completely different direction from yours? By the way, you're employing my ungrateful son who thinks I'm a bum." Before I could second guess myself, I dialed. "Morrison and Associates. This is Jim Morrison speaking." The voice was familiar, but different. Deeper now, polished by years of boardroom meetings and client presentations. Professional. Confident. Everything I'd never learned to be. "Jimmy, it's David Whitmore from Jefferson High." The pause stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd forgotten me entirely. 25 years was a long time. Maybe I was just another name from a past he'd outgrown. Then, "David? David Whitmore? Jesus Christ? How long has it been? How did you get this number?" "You sent me a Christmas card about 5 years back. I kept it." I found myself smiling despite everything. "Heard you're doing pretty well for yourself." "Can't complain," he said, and I could hear genuine warmth creeping into his professional tone. "Started this consulting firm about 10 years ago. Been growing steady ever since. What about you? Still in construction?" "Still swinging hammers and pouring concrete." I confirmed. "Actually, that's why I'm calling. My company just got awarded a contract for some work at your office. Renovation project." "No kidding." Small world. His voice brightened with genuine enthusiasm. "You know, I should have recognized the company name, Whitmore Construction." "That's fantastic, Dave. We should definitely catch up properly when you start the work. I want to hear everything, what you've been up to, how life's treated you." "I'd like that too," I said, and meant it. But there was something else I needed to know, something that was eating at me like acid. Jimmy, I've got to ask you something, and it might sound strange, but you wouldn't happen to have a young guy working for you named Ethan Whitmore, would you? The pause that followed was different from the first one. This one was loaded with curiosity, with the sound of mental gears turning. Ethan? Yeah, he's one of our junior consultants. Sharp kid. Graduated summa cum laude from state. Really bright future ahead of him if he can learn to, well, let's just say he's still figuring out how to navigate the professional world. I could hear Jimmy choosing his words carefully. Why do you ask? Do you know him? Wait a minute. I could practically hear the realization dawning. Whitmore, David Whitmore. Is he? He's my son. The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. I could hear Jimmy breathing on the other end of the line, could almost feel him processing this information, connecting dots that probably painted a picture he wasn't expecting. Dave, he said finally, his voice completely different now, gentler, more careful, loaded with questions he wasn't sure he should ask. I think we really need to talk. The Morrison and Associates building was exactly what I'd expected. Glass and steel reaching toward the sky, the kind of place where people wore expensive suits and talked about quarterly projections over $15 coffee. As my crew and I unloaded our equipment from the trucks, I caught glimpses of the office workers through the windows. Young professionals moving with that particular urgency of people who believed their work was changing the world. I was directing Rodriguez on where to set up the concrete mixer when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Dave? Dave Whitmore. I turned to see Jimmy Morrison walking toward me, and for a moment time folded in on itself. He was older, obviously, his hair silver now instead of the sandy brown I remembered, his frame filled out with the comfortable weight of success. But his smile was exactly the same, warm and genuine, the smile of a man who'd never forgotten where he came from. Jimmy, I said, pulling off my work gloves to shake his hand. Good to see you. Jesus, look at you, he said, gripping my hand with both of his. You look exactly the same. Maybe a little more weathered, but construction'll do that to a man. 25 years of honest work, I said. It leaves its mark. We stood there for a moment, two old friends bridging the gap of decades and divergent paths. Around us, my crew continued their setup, and I could see office workers gathering at the windows, curious about the construction activity. Listen, Jimmy said, his voice dropping lower. We should talk about Ethan, privately. He led me to a small conference room on the ground floor, away from the curious eyes of his employees. Through the glass walls, I could see the main office floor, could see young people at their desks, including a familiar figure hunched over a computer in the far corner. Ethan looked different in his work environment, more polished, more confident than he'd been at the construction site. He wore a crisp white shirt and navy slacks, his hair styled in a way that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. This was the life he'd chosen, the world he'd wanted to be part of, the world where his father didn't belong. Dave, Jimmy began, settling into a chair across from me, I need to tell you some things about your son, and I'm not sure you're going to like what you hear. I braced myself. Go ahead. He's smart, I'll give him that. Sharp analytical mind, good with numbers. But, Jimmy rubbed his forehead, choosing his words carefully. He's got some attitude problems, treats the support staff like they're invisible, talks down to colleagues who didn't go to as prestigious a school as he did, and he's got this need to project an image that doesn't quite match reality. What do you mean? Jimmy's expression grew uncomfortable. Well, for starters, he's told everyone here that his father is a successful business executive, high-level corporate stuff. He talks about growing up with privilege, about family connections in the business world. He even mentioned once that you're involved in major development projects around the city. I felt a familiar ache in my chest, the same one I'd felt when Ethan called me a bum at graduation. He's ashamed of me. That's not even the worst part, Jimmy continued. 2 weeks ago, we had a team-building exercise where everyone was supposed to talk about what they learned from their parents. Ethan gave this elaborate speech about how his father taught him the importance of strategic thinking and leveraging resources. He made you sound like some kind of Fortune 500 CEO. The irony wasn't lost on me. In a way, I had taught him about strategic thinking and leveraging resources. I'd strategically worked overtime for years and leveraged every dollar I earned to give him the best life I could. But that wasn't the story he was telling. I wish I could say I was surprised, I said quietly. Dave, I'm sorry. If I'd known, when I hired him, I had no idea he was your son. And now that I do know, I feel like I'm seeing him completely differently. How so? Jimmy leaned back in his chair, his executive demeanor softening into something more personal. I keep thinking about you in high school. Remember how you used to work at Henderson's grocery store after school? You'd come to class sometimes with flour under your fingernails from stocking the baking aisle, but you never complained, never acted like the work was beneath you. And here's your son, embarrassed by honest work that's 10 times more skilled and valuable than what that grocery store job was. A commotion outside the conference room caught our attention. My crew was wheeling in equipment, and I could see Ethan looking up from his desk with obvious irritation at the disruption. I should get back to work, I said. This renovation won't manage itself. Of course. But Dave, what do you want me to do? About Ethan. Do you want me to tell him I know you? I looked out at the office floor, at my son in his carefully constructed professional world, and felt a plan forming in my mind. Not yet, I said. Let me work here for a few days first. I want to see this for myself. Over the next 3 days, I got a front row seat to my son's professional life. The renovation work put me and my crew right in the middle of the office environment, and I watched Ethan like a hawk studying its prey. What I saw broke my heart and hardened my resolve in equal measure. On the first day, I watched him snap at a young receptionist who'd accidentally delivered his lunch to the wrong desk. Do you even look at the names on these orders? He said, his voice dripping with condescension. This is the second time this week you've screwed up something this simple. The girl, who couldn't have been more than 22, turned red and apologized profusely. Meanwhile, Rodriguez, who was installing new electrical outlets nearby, shot me a look that said everything about what he thought of that behavior. On the second day, Ethan was assigned to work with Maria Santos, a middle-aged woman who handled the firm's data analysis. I overheard him dismissing her suggestions with phrases like, "That's not how we learned it in business school," and "maybe you don't understand the sophisticated approach we need here." Maria, who probably had more practical experience than Ethan would accumulate in a decade, just nodded politely and continued doing her job with quiet dignity. But it was the third day that really got to me. I was working on refinishing some concrete countertops in the break area when I overheard Ethan talking to a group of his colleagues about his background. "My father's always been in development," he was saying, leaning back in his chair with practiced confidence. "High-end commercial projects, mostly. He taught me that success is about understanding leverage, knowing how to use your resources and connections to maximum advantage." One of his colleagues, a young woman named Jennifer, seemed impressed. That must have been great growing up, having that kind of business insight at home. "Oh, absolutely," Ethan continued, warming to his subject. He always stressed the importance of presentation, of making sure you're taken seriously in professional environments. And he used to say that perception is reality in business. People need to see you as successful before they'll treat you as successful. I had to grip the edge of the counter to keep from saying something. Perception is reality? The only thing I'd ever taught him about perception was that it mattered less than character, less than honest work, less than treating people with respect, regardless of their position in life. But the worst moment came when Jennifer asked, "Does your father ever visit the office? I'd love to meet him." Ethan's confident expression flickered for just a moment. He's usually pretty busy. Big projects, lots of travel. That's too bad. It would be interesting to hear his perspective on the industry. "Yeah," Ethan said, his voice slightly strained. "Maybe sometime." That's when I knew exactly what I had to do. I waited until Friday afternoon when the office was winding down, but most people were still at their desks. My crew had just finished installing the new reception area countertops, and the work had drawn a small crowd of office workers who were admiring the craftsmanship. "This is beautiful work," Jennifer was saying to Rodriguez. "The finish is so smooth. How long have you been doing this kind of specialized concrete work? About 15 years, Rodriguez replied with pride. But our foreman here, he gestured toward me, he's been perfecting this technique for over 20, real artist with concrete and stone. I could see Ethan at his desk, trying to pretend he wasn't listening, his shoulders tense as more of his colleagues gathered around to discuss the renovation. The detail work is incredible, said another employee, running his hand along the seamless edge of the counter. You don't see craftsmanship like this every day. That's when Jimmy appeared, and I could see the slight smile on his face that told me he knew exactly what was happening. Everyone getting acquainted with our contractors? Jimmy asked cheerfully. We're really fortunate to have Whitmore Construction on this project. David here has a reputation for excellence that stretches back decades. I saw Ethan's head snap up at the mention of my name, saw the color drain from his face as he realized what was about to happen. David Whitmore, Jimmy continued, his voice carrying clearly across the office, is one of the finest men I've ever known. We went to high school together, actually. He's the kind of person who's been teaching people about integrity and hard work since before some of you were born. The group around the counter was listening intently, clearly impressed by Jimmy's endorsement. I could see Ethan frozen at his desk, trapped between his lies and the truth that was unfolding in front of his colleagues. In fact, Jimmy said, his eyes finding mine with perfect understanding, David here has probably taught more people about real success, the kind that comes from dedication, sacrifice, and putting others before yourself, than most business schools ever could. I stepped forward, feeling the weight of 23 years of fatherhood, of sacrifice, of love that had been thrown back in my face. When I spoke, my voice was calm, measured, but loud enough for the entire office to hear. Thank you for those kind words, Mr. Morrison. Though I have to say, some of the most important lessons I've tried to teach over the years. I paused, letting my eyes find Ethan's across the office. Well, sometimes those lessons take a while to sink in. Sometimes people have to learn the hard way about the difference between real success and just putting on a good show. I smiled then, the same smile I'd given Ethan at his graduation, and I saw recognition dawn in his colleagues' eyes as they began to put the pieces together. The same last name, the timing of my arrival, the way Ethan had gone absolutely rigid at his desk. But that's okay, I continued, my voice carrying the finality of a judgment rendered. Because eventually everyone learns that you can't build anything lasting on a foundation of lies. Whether it's a building or a reputation, the truth has a way of rising to the surface. The office had gone completely quiet. I could see Jennifer looking between me and Ethan with growing understanding, could see other colleagues beginning to whisper among themselves. And I could see my son sitting there in his expensive shirt and carefully styled hair, finally understanding that some lessons can't be avoided forever. Sometimes they just come looking for you at work. Ethan sat there like a statue, his face pale as concrete dust, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him with each passing second. I watched him try to shrink into his chair, watched him realize that there was nowhere to hide from the truth that had just walked through his office door wearing work boots and carrying calloused hands. Jennifer was the first to break the silence, her voice barely above a whisper. Whitmore. Oh my God. Jimmy stepped forward then, his expression serious but not unkind. Well, he said, addressing the gathered crowd, I think we've all learned something important today about the value of honest work and the people who do it. He walked over to Ethan's desk with measured steps, each one echoing in the unnatural quiet of the office. When he reached Ethan, he leaned down and spoke in a voice just loud enough for everyone to hear. You know, Ethan, in my experience, the most successful people I've ever worked with, whether in boardrooms or construction sites, are the ones who understand that respect isn't something you inherit or fake. It's something you earn, every single day. Ethan opened his mouth as if to respond, but nothing came out. What could he possibly say? That he'd been lying for months? That he'd been ashamed of the man who'd sacrificed everything to give him this opportunity? I packed up my tools slowly, deliberately, that letting the weight of the moment settle over the office. My crew followed my lead, professional as always, treating this like any other job site. But I could feel their pride in the work we'd done, both the renovation and the lesson that had just been delivered. As we headed toward the exit, I heard Ethan's voice, cracked and desperate. "Dad! Dad! Please wait!" I paused at the door, my hand on the handle, but I didn't turn around. Behind me, I could hear his chair scraping against the floor as he stood up, could hear the murmur of his colleagues as they watched this personal drama unfold in their workplace. "Please," he called out again, his voice breaking. "I can explain. I can." I turned then, just enough to look at him over my shoulder. He was standing next to his desk, his perfect professional appearance somehow looking disheveled despite nothing actually being out of place. It was as if the truth had rumpled him from the inside out. "There's nothing to explain, son," I said quietly. "You've made everything perfectly clear." Then I walked out, my crew behind me, leaving him standing there in the wreckage of his own making. The days that followed were harder than I'd expected. Not because I regretted what I'd done, but because the silence felt different now. Before, the space between us had been filled with anger and disappointment. Now it was just empty. My phone rang constantly, 3 times the first day, 5 times the second, 8 times on the third day. I could see his name on the caller ID, could imagine him sitting in that expensive apartment he could barely afford, trying to find words that might undo what had been done. But I never answered. What was the point? I'd spent 23 years listening to him, supporting him, believing in him. I'd given him everything I had to give, and he'd thrown it back in my face because he was ashamed of where it came from. That was his lesson to learn now. Mine was already complete. To hear the next story, click the box on the left, and as always, thank you for watching.